Paint Care is all about keeping it simple for district residents. They make recycling leftover paint easy with convenient locations like your local paint store. Paint Care has 3 simple rules for painting smarter and reducing waste. 1, buy the right amount of paint for the job. 2, use up what's left. And 3, recycle the rest. To learn more or find a paint drop site near you, visit paintcare.org/3simplerules. That's paintcare.org/3simplerules. Today on CityCast DC, WayMo, Google's driverless taxi service company, says they want to expand to DC next. But are they safe? And would they work with DC's many road quirks? I called up Andrew Hawkins, who covers transportation at The Verge, to find out what driverless taxis would mean for the city. Today's Monday, April 7th. I'm Bridget Todd, and here's what DC is talking about. Andy, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Okay, so for folks who don't know, what exactly is WayMo? How does it work?
Okay, so WayMo is an offshoot of Google's self-driving car project. They spun out of the company several years ago, and now it's under the broader Alphabet umbrella, and it is a robotaxi company for all intents and purposes. It is operating robotaxi, driverless car operations in several cities right now, and has plans to open in several new markets this year and next. And one of those markets is just recently announced was Washington, D.C., which is very interesting choice for them.
Have you yourself ever been in a driverless car?
Oh, yes. I've been covering the driverless car industry for almost a decade now. And I've ridden in WayMo cars. I've ridden with Cruise. I've ridden with, let's see, I'm trying to think of what are some of the other ones that I've ridden with. There's so many. There's been a bunch, and some of them don't exist anymore. WayMo has been remarkably resilient in this industry that has had lots of ups and downs. But yeah, I've ridden with WayMo. I just actually rode one last summer. I go visit my family frequently in the Bay Area. And when I do, I always try to give WayMo a test.
What does it feel like to be in one? Give us a play-by-play.
I can say the very first time I rode in a fully driverless car, meaning one without a human being behind the steering wheel, was a pretty thrilling moment. It was on a private closed course, and it was a pretty thrilling moment. It kind of hits you where like, oh, this is potentially the future right here. But then I would say since then, having ridden in dozens more, the thrill is gone. It's become sort of more of a mundane kind of experience, right? Where you're in a vehicle that's being sort of very conservatively driven, I would say. It's extremely cautious. It rides, it's always never exceeds the speed limit, doesn't usually perform any maneuvers that, give you questions or anything like that, or would raise an eyebrow. It's like riding with your grandmother, honestly.
You mentioned that DC is just one of the cities that they're trying to expand to. What other cities is WayMo currently in?
So they're in Phoenix, they're in San Francisco. They recently are expanding to include sort of the Bay Area. So the towns outside of San Francisco, like Mountain View and Palo Alto. And they're in Los Angeles. And those are sort of the 3 main markets for them. They just got started in Austin, Texas, where they are working in collaboration with Uber. So the vehicles are exclusively available on Uber's ride-hailing app. And then they've announced that they plan on launching later this year in Atlanta. And then next year, they're going to be launching in Miami and Washington, D.C.
So let's talk about D.C. for a minute, because they have said that they plan to launch in 2026, but this does not seem like it's set in stone. I've done a ton of reading on what they've said, what the city has said. First of all, is this a done deal? Like, do they have a confirmed deal with the city to roll out in 2026?
I wouldn't say that it's gone that far. So they're in talks with the city. I think it's important to note that the rules that are currently on the books in Washington would not allow WayMo to operate as it does in these other markets. So the rules state that if driverless cars are being tested within the district, that they need to have a safety driver, a human being behind the steering wheel. That's not how WayMo prefers to operate. They do their testing with safety drivers, and they do a lot of manual testing when they gather mapping data. But when they operate their WayMo One robotaxi service, They do that without human beings behind the wheel, because otherwise, what's the point, right? It's just an Uber or a Lyft if you've got a human being, and you're not going to get sort of like the cool futuristic moment when you're riding in a driverless car. But also, this is about saving money in the long term for the company, right? They've sunk billions of dollars into this project. And so the idea is that eventually they'll start to make money off of it. And they're not going to be able to do that if they have to pay too many employees or drivers to drive these vehicles. So as it's currently written, the rules don't allow Waymo to operate fully driverlessly. But they think that by 2026, they're going to be able to get some sort of deal going with city officials that would allow them to operate. And when I reached out to the city's Department of Transportation, they acknowledged that they are talking with Waymo about this, but they didn't provide a timeline or suggest that they're going to change their rules right away. I think there's going to still need to be some back and forth before something happens there.
So I've seen a lot of reporting, a lot of headlines that are like, Waymo is coming to DC in 2026. A more accurate thing to say might be Waymo would like to come to DC in 2026 and has started conversations with the city to see if that's possible. But right now, it would not be lawful under our current laws. It's a long headline, but that's more accurate.
That would be a lot more accurate, yes. Waymo eyes Washington for a 2026 launch, or Waymo is crossing its fingers and hoping that that Washington. But yes, that is definitely a more accurate way to put it. And this is the case in other markets as well. Like Waymo needs to sort of put officials' minds at ease that its technology is safe. It is safer than human-driven vehicles. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to make much inroads, right? If they can't convince not just, people in the city government, but also law enforcement, people who operate emergency services like ambulances and things like that their cars are not going to significantly impede sort of the day-to-day transportation networks, they're not going to have much success. And so they've had some success in some of these other cities, and they're hoping to replicate that in DC.
I really want to talk about the safety bit of it, because this is what really concerns me. Now, I understand, I've read a lot of information from Waymo. They say that across 25 million miles, their Waymo vehicles were only involved in 9 property damage insurance claims and 2 for bodily injuries. I understand that seems like very compelling evidence that these cars are very safe. What are your thoughts? Are Waymos safe?
I can just say from my personal experience, yes, the Waymo's vehicles that I've been involved with, the trips that I've taken have all been safe, which is not to say that Waymo does not get involved in incidents, right? There have been crashes, there have been injuries. But what Waymo says is that the vast majority of the crashes that have taken place involving its vehicles are usually the fault of other drivers, human drivers. And it is usually the case that they would have been much more dangerous and less safe, or perhaps even deadly, if the Waymo vehicles had not been involved in those crashes. Especially what they rely on a lot is insurance data to that they say proves that their vehicles are operating safer than humans, because sort of that's like the threshold that they're trying to reach, right? When there's property damage that's reported or an injury that's reported to insurance, that's something that they can then sort of bring back and put a burnish on. But yeah, no, I would say that, so far it's looking pretty good for the company in terms of the data that they have been relying on. But we also there's other data as well. For example, the federal government collects data. For now, at least, the federal government collects data on crashes involving driverless cars. And a lot of these have involved Waymo, because Waymo is sort of the one that's out there operating the most driverless cars in the United States. And so there was, a recent report that showed that there were 38 crashes between July of 2024 and February of 2025 involving Waymo vehicles. And again, what we see is that the majority of those crashes were caused by human drivers. 34 of the 38 incidents were actually the fault of somebody else. They were, either Waymo's car was stationary in the road and it was hit, or they were being rear-ended in some instances as well. There was a couple incidents in which a Waymo vehicle was T-boned by a human driver, and it wasn't entirely clear what, sort of who was at fault there. I think it's so far, from some of these independent sources and also the data that Waymo presents itself have shown that Waymo's vehicles have been operating relatively safely.
And I think in DC specifically, that is a big question, because DC is just not really a very safe place for pedestrians. And that's a real problem considering it's such a walking city. DC is twice as deadly for pedestrians as it was 10 years ago. And so, we have a big issue with folks driving dangerously, recklessly, people driving impaired or inebriated. Waymos, they drive, it's like you said, it's like driving with your grandmother. So I do want to acknowledge, as much as I maybe am uncomfortable with the idea of Waymos in DC, that does seem to be compelling that like, hey, Waymo is never going to drive reckless or never going to drive drunk.
It's a really good from a marketing angle for the company, right? If they're trying to convince somebody to take a ride in one of their vehicles, and you're not alone, right? I think we've seen poll after poll after poll have shown that the vast majority of people are still very skeptical, if not outright afraid of driverless vehicles. And so it is clear that we have not reached the public acceptance level quite yet for this technology. And so Waymo needs to sort of market itself as the safer alternative. And I think right now, like that's part of their marketing message, but it's also about, getting the car to yourself and being able to control your music and not having to like make awkward conversations with the driver. These are some of the things that Waymo is trying it out as it sort of slowly expands across the country and tries to, present itself as a viable alternative to Uber and Lyft. And I think the safety angle is interesting because you can't just flip a switch and suddenly every vehicle is going to be a driverless vehicle, right? We're sort of like at the very early onset now of what is potentially going to be a pretty radical shift in personal transportation. And Waymo is sort of at the forefront of that. If they can convince enough people while also still maintaining, safe operations, that they are a safer option for people, then potentially we could start to see a decline in some of these incidents that happen in major cities like DC, where there have been a very worrisome trend. It's going in the wrong direction. More pedestrians are being injured. People are driving dangerously. Especially post-pandemic, we've definitely seen an increase in a lot of these bad trend lines.
People have lost their goddamn minds out there on the roads.
That's, it's sort of, we're in feral mode. Everyone's gotten a little bit crazy. We've forgotten about the humanity of other people out on the road. It's worrisome, right? And cars have gotten bigger. It's harder to drive safer when you can't actually see what's ahead of you, right? Because you're up so high if you're in a truck or a huge SUV. So it is certainly the case that these trend lines are going in a bad direction. Waymo's trying to have some sort of impact on that, but it's going to take a long time before we start to see like a real, I think, noticeable effect of driverless vehicles and whether or not that is actually translating into more safety.
Ever wondered why mosquitoes bite you? Or maybe you're curious about policy, like solving the housing shortage or bridging the digital divide. Or maybe you want to hear it all. After the Fact, a podcast by Pew, breaks down today's big issues with expert insights and real stories. Whether you're into the research or the personal stories behind it, we've got you covered. Get the stories behind the stats. Listen to After the Fact wherever you get your podcasts. If you're a CityCast superfan, you have definitely heard us singing the praises of our longtime supporter, Paulson and Nace. Big news! Paulson and Nace is now Nace Law Group. Same great team, just with a new name. When you are hurt by the negligence of others, you want a lawyer that will actually fight for you, not one that will settle for the bare minimum. Nace's compassionate lawyers fight to bring cases to juries so you can get everything you deserve. If you've been hurt or lost a loved one because of someone else's mistake or negligence, call Nace Law Group for a no-obligation consultation. Visit www.washingtondcinjurylawyers.com or call 202-463-1999. So you just articulated my personal kind of like ideological or philosophical problem with Waymo. It's not a question of like, are they safer or are they not safer? It is a little, but that's not the only thing I'm concerned about. I have a philosophical resistance to this idea that when I leave my apartment and step outside on a public street, that I am essentially an unpaid, unconsenting crash test dummy to get this Waymo technology to where it needs to be, right? Like I'm not saying that it's not safer. It very well may be. And I understand that they need to get this technology to a place where like we all just acknowledge like this is safer, this is better. Maybe it'll be safer. Maybe pedestrian incidents will go down and that's a good thing. But I just feel like I don't like the idea that just automatically I am part of this grand experiment that we really don't know a ton about, as you were saying. It still remains to be seen if overall, globally, this is going to be safer for pedestrians in DC. That's my issue.
Yeah, I think that's a really fantastic point. And I think that's something that I think a lot of city officials need to take into account when they are talking to these companies, right? They're talking to Waymo. They need to speak for their population. They need to speak for the citizens that they claim to represent. And so they need to make sure that they're hearing voices like yours and others who are experiencing some trepidation about being sort of, an unwitting member of this grander experiment that's going on. And I would just say maybe like in Waymo's defense, it's a company, it owns its fleet, it's very sort of upfront about what it's trying to achieve. And its vehicles are noticeable, right? If you see a Waymo coming, you can tell because it's got that LiDAR sensor, it's got those cameras attached to the roof, it's got the branding on the side. It's very visibly a Waymo. Not every company is sort of going about it in that way, right? You got like Tesla, for example, right? That is claiming that it's going to eventually turn all of its customer vehicles, its passenger vehicles that are out there on the road, of which there are millions, and turning them into robot cars. That's where things get a little bit blurrier in my mind, right? When you've got people, passenger vehicles, personally owned vehicles that are out there that are suddenly people using the autopilot features and the full self-driving features, which, by the way, do not make the car full self-driving. It's a misnomer. Don't believe everything that you read.
Thank you for saying that. It boils my beans when I hear people repeat that. And I'm like, oh, you're just like lying. You're just like PR for Tesla now, spreading incorrect information about what their technology is capable of.
It's extremely bad branding. But if you see a Tesla vehicle out on the road, there's a person behind the wheel, but you don't know what they're doing, right? You don't know what technology they're using. You don't know what their level of engagement is with the driving operations. Are they paying attention? Are they looking at their phone? Are they doing something else? With a Waymo vehicle, there's nobody behind that steering wheel. It sort of announces itself as a driverless vehicle. But I do think that the companies could be doing something a little bit more to make sure that the vehicles are sort of like accurately advertising what they're doing and what's going on. And then you've seen some companies are thinking about that kind of stuff, ways in which they could be using various lights or signage or other things like that to sort of announce to the public that they are, operating driverlessly. Ultimately, we're all sort of at the mercy of the cars and the drivers and how safe they are and how safe they aren't being. And it is something that I think that a lot of people are worried about.
Kind of in that vein, like, are there unique things about DC that Waymo is going to have to account for, like specifically that we have here in DC? I'm thinking things like, we've got a lot of tourists. It's cherry blossom season right now. And like tourists who aren't from here will dart into the middle of the road because they don't really know how it works. Or like the presidential motorcade, which is like a huge production when it goes down DC streets. Are there things that Waymo is going to have to account for that is unique to DC that maybe they don't have in Phoenix or other places?
Yeah, 100%. The things that you named right there, I think, are two of the things that are definitely at the top of mind of the folks at Waymo. I think all the roundabouts that are in the district, the huge tourist buses, other things like that, the vast amounts of double parking and triple parking that people tend to do, which I lived in DC. I saw firsthand. I know how it goes. And then I think also just sort of like all of the, sort of like lower speed human infrastructure that exists, the pedestrian paths, the walkways, the bike lanes, bike share is really huge in DC. So making sure that those cars can operate around all those things. And, ultimately, I think what you hope to see, especially in a dense, congested place like DC, is that, with lower speeds in general, because you can't drive that fast as it is because of how many other cars are on the road, that there's not going to be too much opportunity for things to go haywire if they were to go haywire. But I do think that that's something that Waymo has to sort of take into account as it launches in all of these different markets, is what are the sort of the driving techniques, what are the unique features of this particular city that they need to sort of factor into their algorithm, to the way that they train their vehicles. Because while they're out there, they're conducting, hundreds of thousands of trips every week, driving millions of miles every month. They also do things in simulation, right? They have a whole virtual world in which their cars operate that they can put in different scenarios and in different conditions in place. Because I think we've seen, Waymo has trouble in bad weather, right? There was an incident just recently in Austin where there was a storm and the cars basically shut down and ended up blocking a ramp to, I think, one of the highways. because of the weather conditions. In Phoenix, for example, they have these huge dust storms called hababs that they have to take into account. The vehicles can't really operate in because the cameras and their sensors get obstructed. So there's always things going on in all, there's the San Francisco, there's the hills, there's things in every market in which they operate that they have to take into account. And I'm sure there's lots of unique features to DC that they're already starting to think about.
Well, we were talking about this earlier. If you live in the district, you probably are not going to be able to use WayMo to get to the airport because all of the airports in the area are either in Maryland or Virginia, and WayMos will not be able to cross those borders, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And to be clear, WayMo doesn't conduct trips to airports in most of the cities it's currently operating in. I'm glad that we got back to this because Phoenix is the one city where they do airport trips, but they're still testing for that in San Francisco and also in Los Angeles. They have not begun to offer that to their regular customers. It is an issue. It involves highway driving, which is also something that WayMo is extremely cautious about. So when they open up in new cities, they do not operate on the highways right away. That takes time before they feel comfortable. Because again, higher speeds, they want to make sure that the technology is able to handle these different conditions. It's also a huge impediment to the company as a business. Airports are a giant source of revenue for anyone who's operating a taxi fleet or Uber or Lyft or what have you. Like airport trips are sort of like the bread and butter when you operate a taxi service. And not being able to do that right away, I think, is a big impediment to WayMo.
Well, if they can't cross borders, it seems like that kind of defeats the purpose of launching in a city like DC, where going out to Maryland or going out to Virginia is such an ingrained part of like how your average person in the district travels. Like, why did they pick DC in the first place?
I think that they are targeting those places where they feel like there's like a robust ride share, ride hailing and taxi market already. So I think that would include a place like DC. I think also sort of being front and center for policymakers and the government as a potential benefit to the company. They were trying to get legislation passed at the national level in Congress, which has been stalled for almost a decade now, in terms of getting sort of looser rules around the types of vehicles that you can manufacture. So, for example, if WayMo wants to make a vehicle that doesn't have steering wheel and pedals right now, there are a lot of hurdles that they have to overcome in order to be able to do that. And so I think that they want to see legislation passed that could potentially expand those options for them and allow them to produce some of those more untraditional vehicles. So I think being in front of policymakers is a big deal, but also I think it's a normal rideshare market for them as well. And I think that counts in a lot of ways. But yeah, they are limited, right? If you're coming at this from a competitive angle, if you're just a customer out on a corner, you just had dinner, you want to go home, you open up your app, what are you going to choose, right? Maybe you want to try out the new novel futuristic robot taxi service. That might be cool. And you can take a selfie in the vehicle and post it to your Instagram. And, lots of people might be interested in that. But I do think that if you want to get home in the quickest and most convenient and possibly cheapest way, you're going to choose something else. And that's something that WayMo is really trying to confront right now. I think in San Francisco, they sort of established a pretty good foothold in some of these other markets as well, that they are maintaining the service and they are increasing the number of trips that they've been conducting every week. So it shows that there is demand for it. But I think they might end up hitting a ceiling after a certain point if they're not able to expand their service area, the capabilities of what their vehicles are actually able to do, the types of conditions that they're able to operate in. That's going to hit a demand ceiling at a certain point. And I don't think WayMo has like a really good answer for that quite yet.
Overall, how do you think WayMo, if the laws were changed and the city signed off and all of these things fell into place, how do you think it would do in DC?
I think just straight out of the gate as a novelty sort of in the city, I think it's going to do well. I think people are going to be interested in it. We've seen it in some of these other markets as well. People will want to try the cool new thing. There's robot cars driving around the town. Why not? Why not give it a shot, right? I think you'll have some people who are probably a little bit more hesitant, not sure about it from a safety point of view. But I do think a lot of people are going to seek this out. You got a lot of, plugged in, people who are up on the news. They know what's going on in DC. They're young professionals, in the government or, some of the other industries that operate there. So I think that they're going to be, there's going to be sort of a built-in customers already in the district. But I do think I'm curious as to how that's going to evolve over the long term, and sort of what concessions the city might ask from the company in order to change the rules that it has towards driverless vehicles. I would hope that the city is not just sort of going to bend over backwards for them, that there are some concessions in terms of data reporting, incident reporting, other things like that, to make sure that that there's a lot of transparency around this. Because I think ultimately what everyone wants to see with driverless vehicles is that there's transparency, that we have some insight into how these companies are operating, and to make sure that everything is sort of being done above board, because it's a lot of trust, I feel, that the companies are asking of the customers and of the cities. And I think that I would hope to see that's something that goes both ways.
I'm so glad that you said that, like literally from your lips to the mayor's ears, I hope, because what other dynamic would make sense where you're just allowed to operate and like we can't have insight into how that's going and whether or not that's safe for our citizenry. So I'm very glad that you said that. I hope it works out that way.
I do as well. I do think that there needs to be especially assurances from like emergency services as well, because as we saw in San Francisco, this was less so on the WayMo side, but some of the other robotaxi companies that were operating there were not being as forthcoming with their data. And then we were seeing a lot of incidents of vehicles that were blocking city buses, driverless vehicles that were breaking down and blocking, cops and ambulances. So there have been some of these questionable incidents that I think have sort of knowledge of which have spread across into the rest of the country. So I think hopefully DC can take some examples that we've seen in San Francisco and others and apply that to what's going on there.
Andy, thanks so much for being here. This has been so informative.
Oh my gosh, it's been great for me too. Thanks for having me. And I would say good luck to all of you in DC with this WayMo experiment next year. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens.
Good luck. Hey, good luck out there, Bob and Weave. That's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, tell your friend who is constantly using ride shares. We'll be back tomorrow morning with even more news from around the city. Talk to you then.